Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And hi. So for today, me and Izzat will be presenting about negative externalities of production. I repeat, negative externalities specifically in production. So I think it is most appropriate to start off with the definition. So negative externalities in production occurs when the production process results in a harmful effect on unrelated third parties independent of the transaction. Now, an ordinary transaction involves two parties, which are, the consumers and the producers, who are referred to as the first and second parties in this transaction. Therefore, a third party in a transaction is the other party that is not related, such as, society, local residents, basically any sort of entity that is not involved in the transaction process. So that is basically the negative externalities in production, meaning harm. So we'll be looking at a few examples that we can relate to in Malaysia when it comes to negative externalities. First being water pollution. Now, water pollution obviously is a harmful effect to its environment, and it also affects the local residences for, a clean water supply. Now, this is caused by an industry or the production of tires, where due to extensive production and irresponsible discharge of chemical waste, the chemicals go into the river, which causes water pollution. And as a result, Sungai Kim Kim, which is the place specifically, has caused a lot of diseases to be spread among the local residents there. Second example would be open burning. Now, open burning, as you all know, Malaysia is quite renowned with its palm oil industry, and therefore, when it comes to starting a palm oil plant, it requires an open space where people would choose to set fires on forests to clean the space. So these are very obvious examples of negative externalities of production. Basically, when it comes to producing a certain product such as tires or palm oil, the effects that the production has brought about upon the society or the environment is what this negative externality is all about. So now we've understand the key concept of negative externalities in production, we'll be looking at the technical aspect of it, which is the graph. Now, before we dive into the graph, we should also be able to understand a few key terms or keywords that exist or that we must label when it comes to drawing the graph. Now, first is the marginal private cost. Now, the marginal private cost is the change in producer's total cost brought about by the production of an additional unit of good or services, meaning this is the cost incurred by the producers themselves when producing an additional unit of output. Secondly is the marginal social cost. Now, marginal social cost is the cost or harmful impact on society due to the production of one additional unit of output. Now, basically, this is the cost or an effect being borne by the society through one additional unit of output, and this is the formula for marginal social cost, which is social cost equals to private cost plus external cost, meaning the social cost also includes the private cost, but it also includes external costs such as the effects being mentioned earlier. And then we have marginal private benefit. Now, this is the increase in benefit obtained by the production or by the producer through the production of one additional unit of output, meaning this benefit only applies to the producers when producing an additional unit of output. And last but not least is the marginal social benefit. Now, this is the social benefit gained by society through the production of one additional unit of output. So that is the key terms in understanding the graph that will be shown later. Alright, so now we'll be moving on to the negative externality in production curve, where we will be identifying a few key things such as this checklist being given here. We'll be identifying the axis, the curves, the equilibrium point, private and social optimum, misallocation of resources, and welfare loss. So this is basically a checklist of things that you would want to identify or label on your curve whenever you draw this diagram. So we'll start with the axis. Obviously, we have the y and x axis. The y axis is the price, cost, and benefits, and the x-axis would be the quantity. So now that we have the axis, let's mark the checklist there. Alright, so now we'll be moving on to the curves. Obviously, we'll start with an equilibrium. Okay, we check equilibrium there, where obviously this equilibrium indicates the supply and demand. So the downward sloping curve would be the demand curve, which is also the marginal social benefit curve and also equal the marginal private benefit curve. So this is the graph for these for the marginal social benefit curve and the label I've said before. And then we have the supply curve, which is also something that we will be identifying soon. So before we start with basically labeling these two curves that are shown on the diagram, we must also understand that since the marginal social cost is obviously higher than the marginal private cost, again, because social cost is external cost plus private cost, hence it the marginal social cost curve would obviously be to the left of the marginal private cost curve, or in other words, it will be above or to the left. Okay, so understanding that point, obviously we would label the one below or the supply curve as the marginal private cost curve, and then the one on the left or above the marginal private cost curve would be the marginal social cost curve. So these are the curves that we will draw or that exists in the negative externality in production curve. So mark the checklist there. Okay, so I have three key things to identify. So now we'll be moving on to the private and social optimum. Obviously, when it comes to the private social optimum, it is the intersection point between the marginal private cost curve and the marginal private benefit curve. So we will draw it there, label it as Q1, quantity 1, and then we also have the price there, which is P1. So this is the private optimum point for this curve or this graph. Right, so moving on to the next, we have the social optimum point, which is contradictory to the private optimum. It is the intersection point between the marginal social cost curve and the marginal social benefit curve. Alright, so we label it there, label it as Q star, because when it comes to negative externality, you want to identify the impacts that it have to society or the third parties mentioned earlier. So this marginal social cost is our highlight for today, or the social optimum is a highlight, so we want to label it as Q star. And then in correspondence rate, we have the P star. Okay, so these are the private and social optimum points that exist in the negative externality in production curve. Right, so now we've done that, we checked it, we basically mark the checklist there. You want to identify what does this graph mean, or what basically it defines. Does it reflects on anything? So there are two major points that we can highlight or interpret from this diagram. First being the misallocation of resources. Now obviously, as a firm, you would want to produce at the marginal private cost curve or the private optimum, because when it comes to being a firm, you want to satisfy your self-interest, and so your self-interest would be to minimize the cost. So the most minimum cost you can produce is at the private optimum point. So that will be your point of production. Now, what happens when you produce at the private optimum is that the harms or the cost that will be borne by the society would result in misallocation of resources. What does it mean? Because since you produce more, okay, obviously when you produce at the private optimum, you would use more, you would produce a higher output, and therefore you would result in an overproduction. So this overproduction would be the misallocation of resources. Instead, if we produce at the marginal, is at the social optimum, you would not be producing, you will not be overproducing, because this point is where your resources are properly allocated. But instead, you produce at the marginal, at the private optimum to minimize your costs, but you have to produce more, and therefore your resources would be misallocated to the overproduction, resulting in a misallocation of resources. Now, since there is a misallocation of resources, obviously there will be a welfare loss, meaning that there's welfare, or the resources that could be used for the betterment of society is lost here. So where is the area? The area is this area, it's this area right here. So this quantity here, quantity in the shaded region here, reflects on the welfare that is being lost by society due to the overproduction of the firm when it comes to negative externality. So that is the welfare loss, which in general reflects on the negative externality. Because of the welfare loss, so society doesn't gain benefit from that overproduction, and therefore the resources are misallocated. So that is basically the negative externality in production curve. So to go through how we can overcome this negative externality, we'll be moving on to our next point.
In the free market, this situation would continue because profit maximizing firms will only take into account their private cost of production. Therefore, it is up to the government to rectify this situation by cutting out as much of welfare loss as possible. So, here are the possible solutions to negative externalities of production. The first one is tax. Tax firms to increase their private costs. The government could tax the firm in order to increase the firm's private costs and so shift the MPC curve, which is the original supply curve, upwards towards the point of social efficiency. If the tax is equal to the external cost of the production, then we say that the government has internalized the externality, which is forcing the firm to pay for all the extra costs. And if the tax is not equal to the external cost, then it will reduce the loss of welfare but not eliminate it. Thus, there is still a welfare loss, but it is less than under the free market with no government intervention. Here is the graph when tax is applied to the firms. So this is the original marginal private cost curve, and this is the marginal social cost curve. This triangle here is the original welfare loss. Now, if the government puts the tax on, the marginal private cost will become higher. Now, that means the welfare loss will be reduced to a small triangle area, and it will be closer to the marginal social cost curve and optimum point, which is at the point A. So, the government has forced the private company to pay the cost to the society as a result of negative externality of production. However, there are some drawbacks when applying taxes. One, it would be difficult to accurately measure the pollution created and to put value on it to be regained by the tax. Like, what is the value of the social cost, or is the tax covering all the costs, something like that. Secondly, it is difficult to identify which firms are polluting and to what extent each is responsible for pollution. Like, how do you contact each of the firms, and how do you know which firms are polluting more than the others? Lastly, for big companies, sometimes they have their trick to not pay taxes, or they even have no problem paying taxes. So that is why it is said tax does not stop pollution. The second solution is by restricting output. The government could legislate and ban the polluting firms or restrict their output in some way. It could also pass laws relating to measurable environmental standards in the firm's production units. They will increase costs, therefore decrease the production. Because to meet the standards, the firms would have to spend money, thus increase their private costs. However, there are some problems with this solution. One, the ban or restriction may lead to unemployment or and the non-consumption of whatever was being produced, which may have been a valuable product. For example, a paint company. If they are banned, the workers of the firm will be unemployed. Moreover, we society can no longer buy paints as all the paints firms are closed. Secondly, the cost of setting and then policing the ban may be greater than the cost of the pollution. So maybe the government need to spend more money to police the ban than the cost of the pollution itself. The last solution is tradable emissions permits. So the government could issue tradable emission permits. These are a market-based solution to negative externalities of production. So tradable emission permits are issued by the government and give firms the license to create pollution up to a certain level. It's like permission to pollute, and you can pollute until some level, and then you need to stop, or you can buy more permits to continue polluting. So for example, if you have 10 permits and polluted up to 10, you can buy, sell and trade the permits on the market. If you need to pollute more, you can buy more. But if you feel like you are not polluting anymore, you can sell your leftover permits to those people who want to pollute. So it's like you are passing the right to pollute among the firms. This is also known as a cap and trade system. The government decides upon the level of pollution and then splits the total level of pollution up into a number of tradable emission permits, each allowing a certain level of production. At this point, the market takes over. So if you want to pollute more, you can buy permits from the other firms. It seems good because if the firm wants to pollute, they need to buy permits which will increase their costs. But as the solution before, this solution also have its own problem. The first one is the solution does not lead to the reduction of pollution once the allowable limit has been set, because the limit is not accurate to stop or decrease the pollution created. Second thing is the government faces a difficult decision to allow pollution and to decide at what levels. It is really complicated decision to the government because like maybe they are the reason of the increase of pollution. So that is all from our group. Thank you.